Welcome to the Reasons to Believe Plus series. Here we are today for part one of this fantastic series, and we have Bruce Robertson with us, and I'll be asking Bruce Robertson a few questions about our topic today, which is origins. Now, when it comes to topics such as these, he is the master, and I am the apprentice, and that's why I'll be asking the questions, and he will be answering all of them. If you think about Star Wars, he would be, the Jedi Master, and I would be the young Padawan learner. And I know that you're going to get something out of this today. So if you've got a notepad, a pen, if you're high tech, maybe it's a computer. I believe that's what they call them. Welcome, Bruce. How are you going?
I'm going good, thank you, Matthew. And it's nice to talk about our theme today. We started the Reasons to Believe theme with the view of creating a strong theology base about what Christians actually really believe and why they believe that. And also whether there's a rational base to a lot of what we believe. So, yeah.
Yeah, and look, we have been discussing origins. And so, Bruce, to you, why do you think we need to do that? Why is that so important?
Well, it's a great question. The reality is that probably best expressed by Professor Dr. Ravi Zacharias, one of our heroes of the faith. And he would phrase it like this: every person, whatever their worldview, religious, not religious, every person will basically want to know the answers to four key questions: origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. And so each one of us grapples with those four questions. The interesting thing about that is, why do we grapple with those questions? If, for example, you're just the random byproduct of an evolutionary process in the cosmos, there's no real reason that anybody can think of why you should engage with why was I created? Why was I? What's my meaning in life? Where do I find my morality? And where are we going? None of those questions have any meaning or purpose if this whole universe is simply accidental.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's something to really think about. And I think often, and I work a lot with young people, I don't think young people often think about these things. We sort of get caught up in living life week to week, and we don't think about even our framework of theology around these sorts of ideas. Now, I've heard you say many times, Bruce, that we are all theologians. And every time you say that, I think, well, no, I'm not. What are you talking about? I'm thinking, what's this guy on? I mean, I'm not a theologian because I'm a PE teacher. I'm a husband to a beautiful Beck, my beautiful wife. I am all sorts of different things. I'm a soccer player before I'm a theologian. So, Bruce, what do you mean when you say we're all theologians?
Well, Stanley Grenz, in his book Created for Community, speaks about that concept. And he highlights the idea that really theology is basically a set of beliefs about God. Now, even an atheist on that definition has a theology because they have a worldview about God or his or her non-existence. And so there is this fundamental issue for everyone on the planet. What do we believe about God? And are there reasons to believe or disbelieve in the existence of God, for example? So every one of us is a theologian. Now, the other thing about Stanley Grenz and the way he writes that, he's going to go on and say that even our hunger for community, the sense of depth of relationship that we have, is part of the essence of design in our whole makeup. We are created, it's unmistakable, with an imprint and a hunger for community and for relationship. Where does that come from? That's a really interesting thought.
So you just said that we're created, we're designed. Thinking about the beginning of the universe, that's what you're saying. So what exactly happened there at the beginning? How did the universe sort of come into being?
Well, look, I'm not a scientist, and I wasn't actually there, although some of my children thought I might have been. But basically, if we take a scientific view of the cosmos, the vast majority of scientists, particularly in the astrophysics realm, would postulate that the universe began roughly between 12.4 and 14 billion years ago. And the universe began as an infinitely dense subatomic particle, which then explodes into literally all of the expanding universe that we now see. Now, we can have lots of different ideas about that, and there are many conjectural ideas about what happened and why it happened, and the singularity, as it's called by people like Stephen Hawking. But underneath it all, there is this, basically, the universe itself is infinitely compressed. It's fully energized. It explodes into existence. We call that, in most terms, the hot Big Bang. Now, I would say that in some ways that's an interesting way to describe what I think God may have done, but I'm not sure about the science or, for example, the quantum physics that surrounds the early part of the singularity. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot to that particular process. One interesting sideline to that, Matt, is that Paul Davies, the astrophysicist, wrote a book called The Mind of God. And in that book, he talks about the fact that he's not a Christian, he's agnostic, but in the book he talks about the fact that there are certain principles that govern the universe even from its inception that are so profound, these principles, particularly mathematical principles and principles of physics, that so undergird the universe we now see. The universe could not have come into existence without those principles actually predating the universe in some way. So in his mind, in the mind of God, he literally describes God as like this giant impersonal computer who literally designs all of these intricate components into the universe we now see. Now, the mathematics is beyond me, but the principle remains. If I use his logic, by the way, to extrapolate that the universe we now see runs on these finely tuned mathematical principles, I can also extrapolate the idea that personality, which is just as complex as the universe itself, the existence of personality and the existence of, for example, DNA within us, is so infinitely complex that we discover the same basic idea that if God, as a computer program, is the source of all mathematical principles, I would argue that equally by that logic, God is the source of all personality.
Wow.
Because the personality we see in the universe is just as profound as the physical nature of the universe and the chemical processes of the universe. So we see that origins matter. And what we believe about the universe matters a great deal. Let me summarize it like this. You really only have two options. You either believe that the universe created itself, or you believe that it was designed with us in mind. Now, the question then is, which of those two scenarios has the better evidence for it? It'd be my contention, having been an agnostic and now being a strong believer in design, that an intelligent designer has designed every aspect of the universe we see. Now, let's play out the other scenario, though. Let's say, for example, that the universe we see that exists only by accident or because it's one of an infinite string of multiple universes that are basically endlessly, beginning and ending and so on.
Yep.
Now, if that's the case, it's impossible. And I would say it's logically impossible, and most atheist philosophers arrive at this conclusion. It's logically impossible to define any meaning to life whatsoever. You cannot find one. Nor can you find a cause or a morality. You cannot find a purpose. You cannot define a destiny. If we are the product of an infinitely random universe, then our conclusion is nihilistic, bleak, and very dark. There is no other alternative to that conclusion.
Wow.
So origins matter, because if you don't believe in the existence of God, you believe in a meaningless, empty, and very dark and increasingly dark universe. There's the only two options you have. Then Pascal's wager becomes a thing, because Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and scientist, taught us that if I have to choose, I'd rather choose to believe in a God, and if I'm wrong, I've lost nothing. But if I choose to believe there is no God and it turns out there is one, then I've lost everything. So Pascal's wager makes an enormous amount of sense.
What's the greater risk?
Yeah, exactly right. And I would argue that the person who has an innate belief in the existence of God has a better life, actually.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not just about what comes after, because for the believer, there's so much. There's new life today. There's so much purpose in right now, not just for the rest of eternity. So a question that a lot of people of faith actually ask, and we've established here that, okay, God created the universe. And so here's the question. If God created the universe, well then, who created God? If he is the cause of everything, well then, who or what caused the cause? How did he even get here?
Yeah, it's a seemingly profound question, and one that is thrown up in a range of contexts. And again, I'm not a scientist, but I want to take a little bit of a scientific view for a moment. If we were able to draw two axes, we might say, for example, that we experience life as human beings, for example, in a series of points. It's basically time controlled. We experience life sequentially, and minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. That's our experience. The problem is when you ask a question like, who created God? You're projecting onto God the same view of time that you live under. In other words, you're making time appear to be an absolute. What's interesting about that is that in his theory of relativity, Einstein demonstrates that time is actually not an absolute. Time is relative. There is such a thing, as we've talked about previously, as the time-space continuum. If you've ever seen Back to the Future, you remember the Doc is always telling Marty,
Classic.
We have to watch out for the time-space continuum. We must not disturb the time-space continuum. And I love that. I love those movies, actually. But I think that the interesting thing about time is that time is not absolute. In fact, time begins only and can only have existence where space commences. So in other words, prior to the Big Bang, time has no meaning. It's actually a timeless state. So the Christian theologian has always believed, even since the time of Augustine, that God was outside of time. And he literally speaks time into existence by declaring space into existence. If the universe, let's say that the Big Bang is a picture of the way God created, I'm not sure it is, but let's say it is, then the Bible says that God spoke the universe into existence. He breathed out, he declares the universe, and what we see is this expanding universe. He breathed out, the universe is birthed, time begins. Space begins, matter begins, energy begins. All of those things flow out of one entity. I just can't wait for the day when he breathes back in, but that's another thought.
Gone.
Yeah. In fact, some scientists refer to such an event as a possible idea called the Big Crunch. It's quite an interesting idea.
Wow.
But anyway, that's
more than
that's
a Cronulla Sharks player smashing a
crunch.
Newcastle Knights player.
Yeah, well, that's just typical of the Cronulla Sharks.
Biggest crunch.
They're quite
legally.
dirty.
Anyway.
They're not really Christian.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Neither are you. Jokes.
So should we continue on?
Yeah.
Right, thanks.
Sorry.
Here we are talking about, so the reason we ask the question, who created God, is because we live under time and we feel like time is an absolute. But Einstein proved that time is relative. If, for example, and this is tempting, I was to put you in a spaceship and send you out to, say, Neptune, and you were going faster than the speed of light, according to the theory of relativity, by the time you returned, you would actually have aged less than we have on Earth.
Wow.
And you would be less mature, even compared to us.
Is it possible?
Yeah, I know. It's a good question.
Ask my wife.
So if we were to do that, we've just demonstrated that time and space are a continuum, that literally time is variable according to our experience of space. Now, why is that important? Well, let's go back to the question. The idea that someone created God is because we think God is subject to time. God is not subject to time. Time is subject to God. And in fact, the Bible clearly says that. Revelation chapter 1, verse 17, for example, and verse 9, both of those verses speak about Jesus appearing to John. And he doesn't say, I have a beginning. He literally says, I am the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. In other words, he's the source of time. And that is the only meaningful way to understand the universe anyway, because you cannot come up with the universe we currently see without there being a design process inherent in it. It's so finely tuned. And here's a challenge for anybody who's interested in this topic. Just study the fine tuning of the universe. It's one of literally dozens of evidences for the existence of God. But the fine tuning of the universe is so specific that someone calculated that it'd be 1 trillion times trillion probability of it occurring as it currently does.
Wow.
The universe is impossibly fine-tuned to support human life and the cosmos we see. It's really interesting.
And if somebody wanted to continue their study in this realm, where would they go? Do you have any people, I've got one more question to ask you, but before we get there, what could they look up? Are there any particular philosophers they could look into or resources that come to your mind? I know this is off the top of your head, but...
Yeah, look, there's a few key people that I have always enjoyed reading and studying with in terms of, I've mentioned Dr. Ravi Zacharias. There is an incredible series of resources in a website and Facebook page called Reasonable Faith with Professor William Lane Craig.
Oh, yeah.
Also, I strongly recommend anything written by John Lennox, who's professor at Cambridge in mathematics. Absolute genius. And by the way, he's one of the guys who has significantly refuted Dawkins in the debates about evolution. And another one that I particularly love is actually The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was an atheist who converted to faith based on his study in, for example, origins. He was shocked to find there was far more evidence than he ever previously thought possible. Yeah, it's a great question though, and I encourage people to read, particularly people in your generation, because I feel like your generation are searching for two things. We'll talk about this later as well. In the next program, we'll talk about identity, because we need to think about, well, what does identity mean? But before we even go there, I think they're searching for a sense of meaning, a sense of this innate question of why am I here? What's my purpose?
And look, that leads me to my last question. So God is creator. He's the cause. No one created him. And if God is creator, well, then why? Why did God do all this? Why did he create you, me, plants, animals, the whole universe itself, Neptune and Mercury and the other 6, 7 planets? It's a long time ago, year 9. But anyway, why is the question, Bruce?
Well,
and I know that's a loaded question. Obviously, I know we're going to unpack some things over the next few parts to this series, but just give us a taste.
I would just say this, Matt, that I don't think God is fazed by the question why. In fact, I think he welcomes it. And one reason why God would create is because he's creative. And we're going to talk about definitions, but let me just highlight a couple of things about definitions that I think are important. The first is that if God is God, he is by definition omniscient, which means all-knowing, omnipotent, which means all-powerful, and omnipresent, which means that he's everywhere at once. But he's also eternal, which means he's outside of and above time, supreme over time. He's also a creator. And finally, he is also perfect in character. What's interesting about that, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next week, one of the greatest and most incredible definitions of God is that God is love. The Bible doesn't say he has love or he chooses love. It actually is describing his essence. His entire being is love. And in that sense, it's impossible for him to act outside of love. And so that is as good a way as I can think of to finish episode 1 today, to think about the fact whatever your experience, whatever your doubts or anxieties about God, one thing is for certain, God in his nature is loving toward you. And we'll pick up some of those questions about why in the next series.
Fantastic. Hey, thanks for tuning in to part 1 of our series, Reasons to Believe. Stay tuned for part 2 coming up very soon.